In times gone by, garments were made by hand from natural materials. Now those who purchase modern clothing and bedding from stores are clueless on how to make replacements. After the pole shift, survivors in industrial countries will be thrown back to a lifestyle prevalent centuries ago. What will you do when your shoes are in pieces and your clothing is in shreds? It's really not that complicated. Start your education by learning about natural fibers and materials. Familiar and easily obtained materials are wool from sheep or shaggy animals, cotton, and flax fibers for weaving into linen. All are amenable to being combed into long fibers in preparation for being spun into yarn or thread. Wool is washed to remove dirt and oils, linen soaked to rot away plant material from the fibers, and cotton simply cleaned of husks and seeds. Since wool tightens and shrinks when heated, a type of cloth called felt can be made from small scraps. The felting process is to lay wool fibers in different directions, then pour boiling water over the lot. Felt is durable and wet and can be formed into slippers. After being spun into yarn, fibers such as wool can be knitted into garments using a pair of knitting needles or crocheted via a crochet hook. Transforming natural materials into clothing in this way has been done by idle hands in the evening around the fire for centuries. Curing leather to be used in coats or shoes or chaps is messy at first because the leather must be scraped clean. There are many chemicals used for curing leather, but one survivors are almost certain to be able to obtain is the time-honored tannin from the bark of many different trees. Some rivers even owe their dark brown color not to mud, but tannin from trees. Hides are stretched on frames and immersed for several weeks in vats of increasing concentrations of tannin. Soaking the leather in a mash from the brains of the animal is another tanning technique. Clothing requires needle and thread at some point, whether stitching by hand or by machine. In the future, when electricity might not be available, a treadle sewing machine is just the thing. They can be found at yard sales, in barns or antique stores, for sale on eBay, and even manufactured new these days. One can create string and yarn with just a twirling distaff, or one can go into rapid production by using a spinning wheel. Making 3-ply yarn is something that a spinning wheel can accomplish. I, Nancy, inherited my great-grandmother Frederica's spinning wheel and learned how to use it. This is not a mystery item and can easily be constructed by a carpenter using hand tools. Spinning a thread, a rope, or a strand of yarn involves 3 steps: straightening the material to be spun, putting a twist in a thin strand of the material, and winding the twisted strand onto a bobbin. Material to be spun can be any fibrous material such as wool from animals, flax or cotton from plants, or silk from silkworms. Preparing the material involves washing it, and in the case of flax, soaking and working it in water to remove rotting soft matter from the fibers. The clean fibers are then combed straight or carded, an action where the fibers are caught between 2 flat wire brushes, called cards, and pulled in opposite directions. In the most primitive form, spinning is done with a distaff and spindle, where the handheld spindle is moved in a circle by wrist movements, and after a twist is put into the thread, is wound by hand onto the spindle. This process is used in one form or another in primitive cultures around the world. The spinning wheel improves this process, allowing a foot pedal to create the spin while the hands are free to work with the material. The foot pedal is attached to a strap by a special spoke sticking out from the center and to the side of the wheel. When this special spoke is on the downward side of the circle, the foot gives a gentle nudge to the foot pedal, encouraging the motion. When on the upward side of the circle, the foot releases, allowing the pedal to raise up so as not to slow the motion of the wheel. There is a groove in the wheel that holds a cord, and a similar groove in a tiny wheel on the other side of the spinning wheel. The relative slow motion of the larger wheel thus makes for many turns of the tiny wheel, which is attached to the bobbin. This bobbin replaces the more primitive spindle. Enough tension is placed on the cord wrapped around the wheel and thence to the bobbin, so that the cord does not readily slip on either the wheel or the bobbin. The knot in the cord should be as smooth as possible. A portion of the clean and straightened fibers are hooked onto the pointed end of the bobbin, and the turning motion begun. The material is first drawn out gradually to a thin thread while attached to the end of the bobbin. The spinning wheel now is given a twist to the thread. The drawing out of the material should occur simultaneously to the twisting, so that the twist climbs back toward the receding hand. When the material is twisted to an arm's length, the thread is allowed to wind up along the length of the bobbin, coming back to the tip for the next thinning and twisting action. During twisting, a slight tension holds the thread back from winding on the bobbin. To prevent unraveling and give additional strength, the single-ply thread is spun in the opposite direction into a 3-ply strand. This is done by running single threads between different fingers of the hand, skipping the twisting step, and just winding onto a large bobbin while turning the wheel in the opposite direction from the direction used to create the single-ply strands. Unraveling is prevented now because all twists are blocked by an opposing twist. Once you have thread and yarn, you can weave cloth on a loom. Looms can be large or small, producing heavy cloth or something lightweight like linen. The drawings are once again done by Nancy. Yes, I had a loom as well as a spinning wheel and am familiar with the workings. Once again, this is an item a carpenter could construct with hand tools. Weaving requires 2 different threads, the warp and the weft. The warp is long and strung from the front to the back of the loom. The weft is laid from side to side during the weaving process. Looms can be large, several feet wide, or small enough to be placed on a table. Cloth woven on a small loom can be sewn together to make a larger piece. The warp is long, runs from the front of the loom to the back, and is wound around horizontal wooden bars at the front and back. These bars turn to wind the warp at the front end, or unwind the warp at the back by using a simple notched grip attached to the ends of the bars. The warp is strung by winding continuous thread around pegs on a warp frame. Wind the thread back and forth several times, creating several warp threads at one time. Then grip the bunch on both ends and transfer the warp lengths to the loom frame. This is done repeatedly until the warp is as wide as the loom or as wide as desired. Make the warp as long as possible, as the very front and back of the warp can never be woven and becomes waste or fringe. The warp threads on the loom are threaded through heddles, which are also made of string or thread. A heddle is in essence a small string loop inside a larger string loop, with the small loop at the middle to hold a warp thread so it can be raised or lowered during the weaving process. The heddles are made on a heddle frame composed of 3 nails on a board, the top loop tied above the middle nail, then below the middle nail, then below the bottom rail. The warp threads are strung through the heddles in the two heddle racks so that the odd warp threads go through the heddles on one rack and the even warp threads go through the heddles on the second rack. Then by pressing one thread or the other, the warp threads are raised and lowered by a pulley action, creating a crisscross that secures the weft threads passed back and forth across the warp. The weft threads are wound onto a bobbin, a metal rod that is passed back and forth across the warp threads inside the shuttle, as though they were sailing across the warp threads inside a tiny boat. The shuttle is a size that can be held in the hand, longer than wide, and the wood is smooth to avoid snagging during the weaving process. The shuttle has a rectangle cut from the center where the filled bobbin is placed. The metal rod of the bobbin is held in place by notches at the end of this hole. A slit is cut at the side where the weft threads unwind. After the shuttle is passed and the weft threads pulled so there is no slack, the beater bar is pulled forward to tap the weft snugly against the crisscross of the warp threads. Then the beater bar is dropped back away from the weaver and the warp threads reversed by the heddle puller action, controlled by the foot treads. The beater bar has a thin wire or reed to go between each warp thread and is not used with force but a gentle tapping action. Different patterns can be woven into the material by alternating colors in the warp thread and using a number of shuttles, a checkerboard by alternating groups of red and white warp threads, and also alternating groups of red and white weft threads. The edge of the material should be kept trim so the material won't unravel when the material is removed from the loom and the warp threads are tied on both ends. And these can be left as a fringe or woven back into the material with a needle to secure them.